All right, welcome to WSQ number 10. Today we're going to talk about the cell in its environment, and specifically we're going to be talking about a few different functions that happen, processes that happen within the cell, which are really key and pivotal to understanding what actually is happening in the cell. So a couple objectives today. How do most small molecules cross the cell membrane? So we're going to talk about how molecules actually get from one outside the cell to inside the cell and vice versa. We're going to talk about why osmosis is important to cells, a particular function related to water. And then we're going to also talk about what is the difference between passive and active transport. So what's happening in the cell when we have passive transport, what happens in the cell when we have active transport. So those are the different ideas. Now, to help us out from the beginning, we have to understand, first of all, what we're dealing with when we look at a cell. As you might remember and recall, when we look at a cell, on the outside of the cell, whether it's a plant cell or an animal cell, you're going to have a cell membrane. And the cell membrane protects the contents of the cell. It also helps control what materials are allowed to enter and what materials are allowed to leave. So for example, materials like food and oxygen are needed by the cell, so they'll actually be allowed into the cell. Okay, whereas waste materials and other structures that need to leave the cell are allowed out. What's interesting is, of course, there's things that we want to protect from, viruses and bacteria and things like that. And so the cell membrane helps the cell do that better and effectively. And you can look right here, you can see the cell membrane that's around the outside protected area of the cell. Now, the first of the two process we're going to talk about is called diffusion. We'll have a chance to kind of play around with this one a little bit in class. Diffusion is the process by which, it's the main method by which small molecules move across the cell membrane. And what happens in diffusion is molecules move from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. So here's a little example for us to take a look at and see if this makes sense for us. So as we see right here, here we have a cell, and notice outside we have a large concentration. This is supposed to represent oxygen. So we have oxygen molecules on the outside and we have oxygen molecules on the inside. Now, you can notice obviously there's a lot more oxygen molecules on the outside than on the inside, right? So there's all of these oxygen molecules. So what will happen is during diffusion, the oxygen molecules on the outside will be pulled in, okay? So these oxygen molecules will be pulled into the cell during diffusion to help balance out the concentration. Now, if you were to count this up, what you would find is the concentration of molecules on the outside is equal, okay, to the concentration inside the cell. So diffusion is this really cool process by which you can actually move substances from one place to another. Now, you can see this very clearly. Take a glass of water and you pour a teaspoon of sugar into that glass of water. The sugar will diffuse throughout the entire glass of water. See, what happens as the sugar drops into the water, it diffuses throughout the entire substance. If it didn't, what would happen is it would taste just like water, except for that one portion where that sugar is. Now, as we stir it up, that sugar gets diffused, it dissolves into the water, and it sweetens the entire beverage. So that's an example of diffusion. So what's cool about diffusions is what causes them. What causes diffusion is the molecules are constantly moving, okay? And as they move, those molecules, as we learned from the kinetic theory and physical science, we'll talk about that next year, but as the molecules bump, okay, they transfer energy from one to another. And the more that there are molecules in a given area, the more collisions there are going to be. And so as each collision happens, the molecules push away from each other. Over time, what happens is those molecules actually will move out and spread out and actually allow them to move from one object to another. Okay, that's the process of diffusion, from outside the cell to inside the cell, which is great. Second example, all right, so that's diffusion, is that first example. Second example is osmosis. Now, osmosis is a form of diffusion. Osmosis is when water diffuses through a selectively permeable membrane. So this is vital in plants and animals because we need water in our cells. Water, remember, is very important, as we learned in the last WSQ, for aiding in different types of chemical reactions that happen in the cells. It's important in photosynthesis for plants and other different things that we need it for. So What happens in osmosis, because cells can't perform well without water, they have to have a mechanism that allows the water to move in and out of cells. So here's an example. This is an example from your textbook, which I like. Let's say you have a normal red blood cell here. On the inside, we have water molecules. On the outside, we have water molecules as well. Now notice in A, the concentration of water inside the cell is the same as the concentration of water outside the cell. Well, look at B. If we have in example B, we have where there's a larger concentration inside the cell than outside the cell. So if there's more water inside the cell than outside the cell, what'll happen is that water will start to move out of the cell during osmosis because it wants to get back to A, where there's a normal concentration of water in and out. Sometimes you have a high water concentration outside the cell, like in this case, and then the water wants to move into the cell. Now, why this is so important is what happens in osmosis is this, notice here, in a normal example with a red blood cell, the blood cell is actually normally shaped. It's round, as it should be. The water is actually allowing pressure on the red blood cell to help give it shape. Okay, but look what happens in the second one. If there's too much water inside of the cell and not enough in the outside, you actually get a blood cell that is misshaped. It's kind of pushed like a water balloon that's got too much water in it. Okay, and so what happens as that water moves out of the cell, it helps bring it back to its normal condition. So the concentration that happens inside of a cell is very important, and this allows in the example here with osmosis, this also explains things. What happens when we put, let's say, we're going to be doing our chicken egg experiment pretty soon, where we're going to look at how chicken eggs deal with osmosis, okay, and the change of an egg between being in just pure water, being in salt water, and how you can actually see the process of osmosis happening through a chicken egg, which has a selectively permeable membrane that actually protects the egg. So that's osmosis. Osmosis, the diffusion of water through a selectively permeable membrane. And remember, osmosis is important because it allows us to actually have adequate water in our cells. Okay, so vital, important. Now, the important thing is what we've just talked about is those are both examples of what is called passive transport. Okay, passive transport is any process that does not require the cell to use its own energy. So if you saw in the example of osmosis and diffusion, there's no actual cell energy that's being caused, that's being used. Okay, so in passive transport, you have a high concentration of oxygen or water, and it just comes right in. Okay, very simple. It's actually just comes in through the membrane naturally because of the imbalance of those particular items. In active transport, you have the movement of materials through a cell membrane using cellular energy. We see this down below. This would happen in a situation where I've got a high concentration of a particular substance, but I need more. Well, it's not naturally going to go across the barrier, so there's a transfer protein, which is in the cell membrane, that actually grabs and pulls, okay, it takes energy to grab that particular item and bring it through into the cell. That's an example of active transport. So active transport needs energy to move things through into a cell. Passive transport, there is no energy that's needed to do that. Now, some substances that are important and are carried out into the cell that way would be things like sodium and potassium and calcium, which actually have to be actively transported in and out of the cell. They can't just go through simple diffusion like oxygen or water through osmosis. There is a cool activity I'd encourage you to take a look at, CED 3014 on phschool.com on cellular transport, which would be worth your time to take a peek at. I would encourage you to look at that. And that is it for WSQ number 10. Oh, and I'm tired, so I'm ready to go home. So hopefully you've watched it, you've summarized, you answered the questions on haiku, you've been faithful in that, and I will see you guys in class later.